July 1, 2010. Huntsville, Texas. The execution chamber inside the walls unit is silent except for the quiet instructions of prison officials preparing for another lethal injection. Michael James Perry lies strapped to the gurney, knowing there are only moments left before the sentence handed down years earlier will finally be carried out. Beyond the glass, two families wait together, separated not by distance, but by grief that could never be shared. One has come to say goodbye to a son. The other has come hoping to witness the end of a chapter that began with unimaginable loss. Then, just as the procedure begins, Perry breaks the silence with words so personal that they leave everyone in the room frozen. They are not directed toward the witnesses, the guards, or even the family of the victims. Instead, they are meant for someone who is no longer alive. Those final words would become one of the most remembered moments of his execution, but they tell only a small part of a story that had been unfolding for nearly a decade. Behind them was a case filled with disputed evidence, failed appeals, heartbreaking loss, and a relentless fight over guilt, innocence, and justice. By the end of this video, you will understand why Michael Perry's final moments continue to spark debate long after his execution ended. The final day of Michael James Perry's life unfolded beneath the weight of a decision that had been years in the making. Behind the walls of the Texas death chamber, every minute followed a familiar routine, yet nothing about the day felt ordinary. Outside, attorneys continued searching for one last legal opening, hoping that somewhere inside thousands of pages of court records, there remained a reason to pause an execution that had divided legal observers for years. Their argument centered on the timeline of the murders. They maintained that Perry had been in custody on an unrelated traffic matter when one of the victims was allegedly killed, insisting that forensic conclusions presented during the original trial left unanswered questions. Those claims had already been reviewed by multiple courts, but with only hours remaining, the defense made one final attempt to persuade judges that irreversible punishment demanded another look. The response came swiftly. Every remaining appeal failed. No emergency stay arrived. The execution schedule remained unchanged. Inside prison, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Once the legal process ended, attention turned away from court filings and toward the inevitable reality waiting just beyond the cell door. Staff members followed established procedures while witnesses prepared to travel to the prison. For everyone involved, the uncertainty had disappeared. Only the clock continued moving. Perry had spent years living under a sentence of death, navigating appeals that repeatedly challenged both the evidence and the investigation. Throughout that time, he consistently denied being the person who murdered Sandra Stotler, even while acknowledging involvement in events surrounding the crimes. His attorneys argued that responsibility for the fatal shooting belonged elsewhere. Prosecutors answered that the evidence, including testimony, physical findings, and Perry's own statements, demonstrated otherwise. A Texas jury had accepted the prosecution's version years earlier. After hearing days of testimony, jurors found Perry guilty and later concluded that the death penalty was the appropriate sentence. Every major appeal that followed upheld that verdict, leaving little room for further legal debate despite continuing criticism from the defense. By the afternoon of July 1st, the courtroom battles had ended forever. What remained was a quiet countdown inside one of the most closely watched execution cases in modern Texas history. As the evening approached, preparations inside the prison continued with practiced precision. Every step followed established protocol, reflecting a process repeated many times before, yet no execution ever carried exactly the same emotional weight. Behind each scheduled procedure stood families, investigators, attorneys, correctional staff, and years of irreversible decisions that had led to a single moment. Witnesses gradually assembled on opposite sides of the viewing area. Among them were relatives of the victims, people who had spent nearly a decade waiting for the sentence to be carried out. They arrived carrying memories that no court ruling could erase. For them, the execution was not the beginning of another legal chapter, but the closing page of a tragedy that had started with unimaginable violence. Across the prison, Perry prepared to leave the cell where he had lived for years. Those who encountered him during his final hours described someone who appeared composed. He spoke quietly with prison personnel, spent time reflecting on his faith, and remained consistent in his position that he should not be remembered as the person who murdered Sandra Stotler. Although every appeal had failed, he never publicly abandoned that claim. Only days before his execution, filmmaker Werner Herzog had interviewed Perry while producing the documentary Into the Abyss. Their conversation was not focused on proving innocence or guilt. Instead, it explored the broader human reality of life on death row and the moral questions surrounding capital punishment. Herzog later acknowledged that the evidence presented against Perry was substantial, yet the interview also revealed the complicated humanity that often exists even in the most disturbing criminal cases. Inside the execution chamber, every movement unfolded according to established procedure. Medical personnel completed final preparations while officials confirmed identities, documentation, and witness arrangements. Silence settled across the room as the final minutes approached. Outside those walls, the murders of Sandra Stotler, her teenage son Adam, and Adam's friend Jeremy Richardson continued to define the case. Their deaths had devastated multiple families and left a lasting impact on the community. Years of investigations, trials, appeals, and public debate had never changed that central truth. 3 lives had been violently taken, and everyone present understood that nothing about the coming execution could restore what had been lost. When the appointed time arrived, Michael James Perry was escorted into the execution chamber and secured to the gurney. Witnesses watched through the glass as officials completed the final procedural checks required under Texas law. The room remained quiet. Every person present understood that once the process began, there would be no further appeals, no additional testimony, and no opportunity to revisit the questions that had surrounded the case for years. Perry was offered the opportunity to make a final statement. He spoke calmly, expressing love for members of his family and speaking about forgiveness and faith. His words reflected the beliefs he had embraced during his years on death row rather than any attempt to relitigate the evidence presented at trial. For relatives listening from the witness room, the moment carried very different meanings. Some searched for closure after years of grief. Others focused only on the memory of the 3 people whose lives ended in October 2001. The lethal drugs were then administered according to protocol. Within minutes, Perry stopped responding, and a physician confirmed that his life had ended. The execution marked another chapter in the long history of capital punishment in Texas, but it did not end public discussion of the case. Supporters of Perry continued pointing to disputed forensic conclusions and questions raised by later reviews of aspects of the investigation, arguing that uncertainty should have prevented an execution. State prosecutors and reviewing courts reached the opposite conclusion, repeatedly finding that the conviction rested on substantial evidence presented to the jury, including witness testimony, physical evidence, and Perry's own admissions. After years of appeals in both state and federal courts, every judicial review ultimately upheld the sentence. The story of Michael James Perry remains difficult because it contains 2 realities that exist side by side. On one side are 3 victims whose families endured devastating loss and believed justice had finally been carried out. On the other is a man who maintained that the legal system reached the wrong conclusion about his role until the very end of his life. Those opposing perspectives continue to shape discussions of the case long after the execution itself. Whatever conclusion readers reach, the lasting legacy is a reminder of the enormous weight carried by every capital murder prosecution, where the search for justice, accountability, and certainty can have consequences that cannot be undone. The Michael James Perry case continues to raise difficult questions long after the execution itself. Court records, appeals, interviews, and documentaries each reveal different pieces of a story that still sparks debate among legal experts, journalists, and true crime audiences. If this case challenged your perspective, we encourage you to continue exploring the available public information and decide for yourself where the evidence leads. Here on Court of Secrets, we examine the cases that refuse to fade from public memory. Stories where the facts, the legal process, and the human consequences intersect in unexpected ways. If you enjoy thoughtful true crime documentaries that go beyond the headlines, consider subscribing so you don't miss our next investigation. We'd also like to hear your perspective. After reviewing the evidence and the history of this case, do you believe the courts reached the correct verdict? Or do you think unanswered questions still remain? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below, and join the conversation with others who are examining the case from every angle. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.